In this episode of Wanted, a Midlife Hobby, we'll map out a creative new hobby idea, traveling. Scott Wayne has traveled the world and has visited all of the United States and has written 3 books about it. We were able to catch up with Scott from a place he only occasionally visits, his home in Denver, Colorado. All right, we are here with Scott Wayne, and very happy that you are joining today, Scott. We are going to be talking about traveling as a hobby, as a potential hobby. As you know, one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out what I'm going to do with all this wonderful spare time that I have with my life right now. And I am very curious to start out with, I know you do a ton of traveling. How did the travel bug first find you? What was kind of like your inspiration to start doing travel?
Hey, Rob. I'm good to be here and good to see you again. It didn't start out real romantic in that we grew up in Minneapolis, suburb of Minneapolis, and I think it's a fairly wealthy suburb now. The United Healthcare money seemed to flow in there, and there's a great lake that's got tons of bays, so there's beautiful homes and all this neat stuff. We were landlocked. We were the poor kids. But we took our summer vacations every year up to, it's just past the middle of nowhere, North Dakota, a place called Rolla. 1,500 lives, and the good hotel was down the road, the Indian reservation. But my dad grew up there, and my cousins, I guess his sister's brother, his brother-in-law had a really good-sized farm. He had another sister down in a smaller town. So he's a North Dakota guy, and every summer for 2 weeks, we would load up the station wagon, brother, 2 sisters, mom, dog, no air conditioning, and we'd drive, I think it was 500 miles northwest.
Wow.
And it's 3 miles from the Canadian border in the middle of North Dakota. So if you do want to define nowhere, that's pretty close. Currently there's probably 500 miles in any direction until you can get sushi, and probably 100 miles till you can find any Chinese food. So, but it was really fun. They had some cattle, they had a barn, a hayloft, tons of space, tractors, pickup trucks, and bring the BB guns. And it just was one of those traditions that kind of married tradition and fun, and maybe even a little family. So I'd look forward to it every year, and then probably branched out a little. I think another driver might have been, as a history major, so looking at all the maps back in the day. Remember, whether it's high school or college, you'd have maps in every room, the big 4-foot by 4-foot maps of the world, of South America, of Europe, all the maps. And I don't know, short attention span before they had Ritalin, and I just started looking at maps, thinking of places to go. So I think the big one, though, that kind of rocket fueled was junior year of college. I went to Morocco on a missions trip with a evangelical group at Eau Claire, which we went to school. And that was so exotic and so different in 1982 for a Midwestern kid. Beautiful country, super friendly people, weird food, camels, goats all over the place. It was your stereotype that was real back in the early 80s.
No camels and goats in the Midwest?
They're more south, I think. But and the goats are cool now. Well, they might not have been back then. But I think that was the real driver when I got some international experience, and just like, wow.
Okay. And I'm glad you brought up both domestic and international, because I know in past conversations, you've talked about you are a 50-50-50 guy. Talk to me about what that is and what it means to you.
Yeah, well, there was at work, I guess it came to me kind of as a shtick, maybe stealing from the 30 for 30 from ESPN and having a cool number. But we used to go around do training seminars for certain health plans, and one of the lead trainers that we hired on would do a little intro game of, I don't know, tell us a couple things, and then something interesting, something boring. You had a couple different angles to do it, but I had to come up with something. Then I realized I am over 50. I've hit 50 states, and then I'm zeroing in, or actually it was passing, just had hit 50 countries. So the 50-50-50 thing, age, states, and countries, was my shtick for the intro as we traveled around the country.
When you're figuring out from the country's standpoint which ones you actually want to visit, I mean, what are you looking for when you're trying to figure that out?
Yeah, I think it's evolved over time, but there was some, I guess, back to those history maps. And, when I had a good teacher telling about something or other, you'd strike a chord. I guess diversity in the sense that you want to try different things, not just culturally, but almost caught in time. I went to both Bulgaria before the wall fell, and then Vietnam just early 2000s. So it was still, I guess I wanted to get to places that were authentic before they became Epcotized and kind of, so greased for tourism and everybody knows about it and they rush there. And I think like Croatia would be an example now where it's beautiful, it's wild. And then Game of Thrones came along and everybody seems to go there. It's just overrun. So that was part of it. And then there were the main ones. Being, I guess, European focus on the history, you got to hit London, Paris, Rome, and those countries, and a lot of World War II stuff. So Europe was a natural, and then starting to branch out into different continents. I like it dry, I guess. I hate getting rained on. Chile, Argentina are good places. And maybe it's also a function of timing. But the summers are awful crowded, so I like to travel May and September on the shoulder seasons. The weather's usually about perfect anywhere. It might switch by hemisphere, but May and September are great times to travel. There's not the crowds because everyone's back in school. And it just makes it for nicer. So I guess kind of ad hoc, making it up as I go, but looking at a map or reading an article in this or that magazine at the time, and now listening to this or that podcast or seeing it on the web, a lot different things than when I first started looking.
All right. And so here, based on, I'm thinking of all the different places you've cited, right? And I got to confess, first thing that comes to mind is, okay, if I've read an article all of a sudden on Rome or one of these other countries, it's going to cost me some money. If somebody's first starting out and you're thinking about doing travel as a hobby, however you want to define travel as a hobby, how would you describe what it's probably going to cost or what it feels like from a financial perspective to actually kind of get started on that?
Yeah, I guess a couple points in that. I mentioned, I traveled a lot for work, and that was and still remains the great subsidizer in that I guess a couple points. You can, when you do travel for work, it's a good launch pad if you want to spend an extra, if you're traveling Wednesday through Friday, stay the weekend somewhere and explore. But the main benefit, I think, is most companies still allow you to retain all the points and miles from the hotels and the airlines. And that, I've done a lot of things that I could never have afforded if I was just paying for it myself, or at least in the style. It's kind of fun to go luxury now and then, save up the miles and go first class or stay at a really nice place. So, not everybody has that luxury, I guess, of having a job that they can travel on. So, and I didn't at the beginning either. So I started small and mentioned the road tripping way back, getting in the car and a tank of gas. I think there's pretty much, I don't know, I've kind of decided over time that you can find a city, pretty much any city over 100,000 people, maybe even below that, where you can spend a weekend and find a lot of cool stuff and have some fun. I think the yuppie explosion of the 80s made virtually any city, maybe over 50,000, have at least one really good restaurant if you're into that. Museums, cultural stuff, outdoors, those are all things you can do pretty cheap. National parks are probably the best value we've got. I think you can get it might have gone up, but I think it's $80 for a pass for 1 year. That's good at any national park or national monument, of which there's a lot more. And that, government does a lot of good things well, and this would probably be at the top of the list. The national park system, including all the things that come with it, are great. So Eagle, I can't remember what it's called, maybe an Eagle Pass. That's a heck of a bargain where you can see a ton of stuff, but you don't have to spend a ton unless you want to, or I guess it doesn't seem like a ton to you when you've got miles and points, or let's say you're independently wealthy. I never had a trust fund. if I did, I probably would have traveled a lot different early. But I started out on the cheap, and I still like to do it. And I guess one other thing, when you do travel, like the Hampton Inns, the Fairfields, maybe Holiday Inn Express, all these, the second tier of the big chains, they always come with a free breakfast. They tend to be newer, so at least it's clean. There's no luxury, but anyway, you don't go somewhere generally, unless maybe a honeymoon or an anniversary, where the hotel room matters. So you can get a free breakfast, cheap night's lodging that's clean, safe. I'd recommend those, I guess, to start with, because you can save a ton of money and use it on something else. Oh, and then I guess the cheapest form of lodging might be camping. If you can toss up a tent, I used to do it a lot with buddies back in high school and on from there. It's a lot tougher now as 60 rears its ugly head, as far as waking up in the morning fresh, but it's still really cool. I mean, not just the money savings, but the experience. Again, when it's dry, maybe nothing worse than getting rained on in a tent, since I've never gotten over, like a dog seeing a newspaper. But camping's another way to do it. So there are ways to do it non-expensively, and they're almost more fun, or at least more rewarding.
So I'm curious, which, if you had to choose between going to a park and camping out versus going to a city and exploring the city, which of those two do you like better?
I think it would depend on the day, but I have done a couple times what I call a bipolar vacation. We'd meet up with a buddy or wife. We would say go camping at the Utah National Parks. There's Zion and Bryce that are a couple, 3 hours maybe in Las Vegas. So you spend a couple days in a tent, and then a couple days back at the Bellagio, and you get the best of both worlds. And you can kind of, if you average the cost, it seems a lot cheaper when you've got a couple nights in a tent. So both are great. It depends maybe on the season you're traveling and where. A lot more free time in the summer, especially if you have kids to travel. You probably don't want to be camping out in Arizona in August or the deserts of Nevada, but they're awesome again in September, October. So I like them both. I love cities, but I really like the country too.
Okay. All right. And I know that a little bit about this because I have read some of the books that you have written. And I don't know, I mean, you've written, 3 travel books now? Is that right?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Did you actually set out to be a travel author when you started doing this? Was that kind of like, I want to write about this as I go, or how did that come about?
No, it kind of almost, I think, kind of what you've talked about with some podcasting and what to do in retirement or as a hobby. I like the travel part, and I thought, maybe I should write about it and see if I can do that as I'm retired and moving on with some time on my hands. But it didn't start out that way. In fact, the first trip and book I wrote about did a perimeter of the United States trip where I started up in northern Michigan at the Grand Hotel, amazing place, on Mackinac Island, old fur trading days and the French coming through there back in the 1600s. And then headed west and did counterclockwise for 15,000 miles, give or take. It took 5 months. And that started not as a writing chore. That came after. In fact, might have even been during, because I just started, I was flying around for work and would look through those airline magazines when they used to have those before COVID. Once we start flying again, you'll probably notice there's hey, where's the magazine? I guess they can spread things. So those are gone. But all of them had a map. Usually they're routes, but a map of the United States. And I just start notching every couple hundred miles. I could stay there. This would be cool. Oh, Glacier Park's here. Then you keep going around. There's Napa. I want to stop there. And I just do kind of almost like fantasy football drafts. Every different trip, I would notch different ones. Sometimes I'd take them. Other times I'd leave them. So if you came across those, that was probably me, not just some guy doing it. I defaced the property. And it just kind of grew from there. But when I was doing it, I thought this would be kind of cool. It kind of tie in both remembrance, and I started doing it mostly for family and friends. And then wanted to see if I could do it as maybe more than a hobby. I probably decided I can't, but it's been a lot of fun. And the cataloging of travel is actually kind of a good thing from like I said, family standpoint. Kids, grandkids, this is what Dad did, or this is what Grandpa did. So Was not started out as any kind of plan or goal on the front end. I did learn by the third one, if I do this legitimately and published it, I've got a cousin who does covers for the New Yorker, so he does the art on them. At least it looks cool.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a tax deduction. So back to your question about traveling cheaper. Second one or the third book that I remembered. Oh, I could probably write this off. I did it basically, 20-25% off depending on your tax rate by doing it, and I was out for 2 to 3 months, so it did add up, and that was a kind of an adult onset remembrance. Like, hey, I should do this because it's they're for sale on Amazon. They are somewhere between lease sellers and no sellers, but it's been fun. But they're legitimate from a tax standpoint. So that's one roundabout way to lower the cost of your travel as well.
Yeah. So on Amazon, if you go into the book section and you type in J. Scott Wayne, right, it'll come up with your books.
Yep, that should do it.
All right, we'll give you the pitch in here since you were nice enough to talk to me. I think it's only fair to give you a little bit of a pitch.
Thank you.
We will have more discussion about this midlife hobby after we get back from the break. I am curious, though, also, because I know that the third book you mentioned, that was, you had done the book about really covering the outside states. And in the third book, you covered the inside states. And in all of that domestic travel around the U.S. in particular, is there a favorite place you visited that's not going to make anybody else's top 10? Let's forget about New York City. Let's forget about San Francisco and all that kind of stuff. Is there a place that you visited in particular or something that happened to you along the way that was kind of what you would call your own personal top 10?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess on both of them even. I know you asked about the second, but Mendocino, California, which not everybody gets to because it is a lot further than Napa or Sonoma, the famous ones. That's worth taking the up and down trip along the coast, and it's Highway 1. Beautiful, desolate, maybe not desolate, but definitely isolated, hard to get to, and not spoiled yet. But on the Inside Us was the inside book, play on the U.S., the us part. And I don't know, there were a couple places that were real surprises that I'd never have thought of. Columbus, Indiana, which is, I don't know, maybe an hour something south of Indianapolis. Kind of an architectural gem in that a couple of the companies brought in around the early 1900s a bunch of different architects, and they became known for their architecture. It's not Stepford-like, but there's definitely an element to it that, like, wow, this is completely different. There's some really neat stuff here. Not all Frank Lloyd Wright-ish, but something like that. And then, I guess more naturally, the Sand Hills of Nebraska were another surprise. It's maybe the northwest quadrant of the state. Very lightly populated, and it's more rolling, cool hills with, it's something, the landscape is different than the magnificent stuff, or it's definitely above just the straight plains, but that was like, wow, I could stay here for a while. And I think wherever you go by any state, you can probably find a lot of cool places, let alone the country. And that was what I liked about the inside piece. When I did the perimeter, that pretty much defined itself where you were going to go. But on the inside piece, you could zig and zag and just kind of, I tried to hit, I guess, clockwise this time. Every state make it a smart trip, but you could carve down 500 miles and up another couple. You weren't stuck to a separate route. So I got to explore and see a lot of small town America. And reading about, just stopping historical markers at the Promontory Point where the Pacific Railroad was connected, coming from, I think, Omaha, one across the river in Iowa. Council Bluffs is where it started. And then they started also from Sacramento and met in the middle of nowhere. My family farm was the middle of nowhere. This is a close second. It's northern Utah. But it's really, just thinking these two met up and the amount of, so I'm driving along thinking about the amount of work that these guys had to do. I think it was heavily Chinese labor coming from Sacramento, and heavily Irish and African American from the east. You go through massive chunks of plain, desert, amazing mountains, rivers, lakes. I think that was one of just the awe of travel, thinking like, wow, they did this. And maybe along those lines too, in northern Nevada, there's some highway, so I can't remember it. It's called the loneliest highway in America. It's actually really beautiful, but it tracks the old Pony Express route, where they deliver the mail every 10 or 20 mile stanzas where they toss the sack to the next guy. They keep running. And it only, reading the historical markers, you find out it only lasted really 2 or 3 years, where it's kind of built into American Western legend. But when you picture, as you travel, the historical stuff that went before, and I was in a car, or I guess an SUV, with a lot of CDs, satellite radio, and air conditioning. And the days got long even with that, let alone sitting on horseback for 2-3 weeks, riding across the middle of nowhere where you had to fight for water or something to eat. And it was just, I think that experience of tying in the history of it, and you don't have to be a history freak. You can look at all the roadside markers. Like, we did start as kids. Dad would stop at every one wherever we went, and we'd get out and read it. So old habits die hard. But if you can, I guess, translate that into place and time, it makes it a lot more interesting.
And to talk about history, it's got me to thinking, because I confess, I keep thinking sometimes of, for better or for worse, sometimes in America in particular, we kind of just overrun history in the name of growth and expansion. I mean, do you have trouble finding historical places, or places that at least harken back to and can help represent our country's evolution, and how we've evolved as a country, as a people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question because it's all over. And just when you brought it up, I think of, maybe the East Coast hitting Yorktown, where I've never been, was pretty cool. And then walking the Constitution Trail up in Boston, and that's back to your cheap question, or the financing. That's a walking tour of about 3 hours. So you see, where Paul Revere did the North Church, the USS Constitution. So the East Coast is really easy, I think, to find, or you just stumble on. As you get west, it becomes tougher because the space is so vast. I guess you have to do a little more research on places that you're going. I tend to look up TripAdvisor. It's a wonderful tool for not just restaurants and the best hotels in town or where to stay, but they've also got a function wherever you are, whether it's Boston, Charleston. It's another great historical city. You can plug in things to do, and they'll list their top 10 or 20. So at least if you've got a place you're going in with kind of an open mind or no notion of where you're going, TripAdvisor, it's a really nice thing to have in your back pocket, or on your phone, I should say. But yeah, the history, you do have to look for it a little, depending on where you are. It's tough to find it maybe in where I grew up in the Midwest, of all places. We romanticize the West, and there's all that kind of neat stuff with the cowboys and Indians and the cattle drives. But, from the Dakotas maybe to Ohio, it gets a little, nobody really thinks of that as anything besides where nice people live, present company excluded.
I'm not going to comment on that one way or the other. I am curious. So you're talking about like these wide open spaces and frankly, the use of even TripAdvisor to get some guidance. Does TripAdvisor in particular, because I'm thinking of that if somebody might be listening and saying, okay, I'll use that as a tool. Does it also warn you about potential, problems? I mean, what are some of the challenges that you've been hit with that maybe you obviously didn't expect, or else you would have taken care of it ahead of time? What are the things that kind of get in the way of making any kind of a travel jaunt successful?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think about it, TripAdvisor really I think part of their, I don't know if their revenue model includes it. I think it does, where there's some kind of revenue for them when they advertise places, not just advertising, but they probably have deals with travel companies, hotels, airlines, car rentals. They tend to make things look great, and it's all glossy. Um, I think back when I first started doing it in earnest, like overseas, I would get two books, a 4 doors usually, which covered the upscale to a large degree, at least it leaned that way. And then either Lonely Planet or I can't think of the other one, something Moon, travel guides that were more kind of for the backpacking crowd. If you want to stereotype going through Europe where you do it on the cheap, those would have caveats. The crime is high here. Make sure you cover your camera. They would, warn the LGB crowd that this is not friendly or here a place to go. More kind of cautionary things. So yeah, I guess cross-checking is what I've always done, and you can look up. The net is just an amazing thing to travel with, or at least to, I guess, when you're traveling as well as preparing, you can Google a place, read up on virtually anything, what you're interested in, cultural events, dangers. Yeah, I think that's a lot better. TripAdvisor is very one-dimensional. It'll give you great restaurants, things to do, but it's going to have those smiley faces and kind of a gloss on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do as much research, I guess. I mention it and say you should, but I find it's also easy to wing it now because you're somewhere and you can just click on your app. And I think I've lost something by doing it. I need to go back to maybe better planning. Winging it's great now and then, but I think you can miss a lot of things unless you do good research on, especially the new places you're going. If it's a new country, new city, you want to read up on it with a lot more detail. He asked about the troubles. One of them, I mentioned Bulgaria earlier. Didn't really realize at the time, and this was back before apps, before any kind of GPS. They have the Cyrillic alphabet. So when you're trying to find your way around as an American who doesn't speak Bulgarian or much of anything other than bad German from high school, trying to translate the Cyrillic alphabet on a map in a country you don't know anything about in a cruddy little rental car, that was one of the most frustrating trips, just trying to get anywhere. Road signs, you'd have your map in rough English and then the road signs and trying to translate. It killed a lot of time that could have been better spent. So if I would have known that in advance, and would have been better prepared, just as an example. But research, when you have the time, and if it's a big trip, you really should invest it on the front end.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. There's I guess especially if I'm starting to look forward to doing this, or anybody who happens to be listening is looking forward to it. I mean, the planning piece, you've kind of alluded to it in some of the other comments, but I think that's the first time you've really hit it head on in terms of, how much time do you think you should spend? I don't know how to qualify that. I'm not asking you like in hours, but how would you figure out how much time you should spend on planning a trip if you're going to take a trip?
They probably largely depend on where you're going and how long. If it's a weekend trip to, say Savannah or New York, it's going to be a lot different than if you're going to Europe or maybe South America for the first time, things like that. It's going to be quite a bit different. But I mentioned cross-checking and getting a lot of different sources. If you can talk to people, and I guess one of the better portions of TripAdvisor are there chat lines or pages where you can start asking questions. Sometimes they go unanswered and lonely. Other times you can just read what people have said about a given place, 2-3 years previous, all the way through the present. So that's one way of doing it. Just poking around, travel sites, Chamber of Commerce, whatever you want to look up. Even a Wikipedia, you can start getting some background in the history. And if anything strikes you like, I'd like to see that, or the cultural, I guess, overplan from multiple sources rather than going deep into one. And I think it's going to depend on where you go, how long you go, and what you're really there for. If it's a honeymoon or an anniversary, it's going to be a lot different trip than trying to do a cultural or just having fun. Or if it's a guy's weekend for golfing or what have you. It's going to be a heck of a lot different than, with a partner having some fun.
We don't want to have an architectural planning thing for a honeymoon. You don't think that's a good idea?
The architectural tour on the river in Chicago, I recommend to anyone for almost any setting. I've done it maybe 30 times, used to live there.
Wow.
And when relatives or friends would come in, it's like one way to kill a couple hours and have a really good time. And the docent is different every time, as is the weather. The city actually is changing pretty well. So it's one of those, architectural tours I would not diss. They're really pretty cool. And you have to tie in history, and it's fun listening to the docents, the way they spin different things. There's always Mrs. O'Leary's barn is what's on the side of it now in Chicago, which you can see from the river, is the Chicago Fire Training Academy. Somewhat ironic and amusing. And they always mention that. So
that's great.
Just an example of, you can find fun and interesting things pretty much anywhere, but that's a good one. The architectural tours. I'd plug that to anybody at any time.
All right. Fantastic. That's great. All right. I have two other questions I'm going to ask you that I'm going to try to be consistent with as I'm talking to people. So first question. Anybody who listens, I think, to this podcast is likely to be a 9-to-5er, or, as much as I don't know how to define a 9-to-5er anymore, because I'm not sure it exists in the way that it certainly used to exist. But if someone right now is listening and saying, look, my job is getting in the way of me taking up travel. I know in your case, you've already talked about the idea that, well, in this case, your job actually helped launch your ability to travel. But for somebody who doesn't have that benefit, what would you tell them if they're thinking that their job is going to get in the way of travel right now?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, you could tie things on if you have any type of trouble with it. Even if it's, once a year, you might go to a training seminar in a different city. If it ends on a Thursday, stay the long weekend, or stay the short weekend if it ends on a Friday. So you can kind of get a jump from there, but you can also start small. I don't know, weekend trips. I'm fairly new to Colorado, where I'm living now. And if you go west of Denver, where I am, you cannot really but help to find beautiful places. And there's tons of them up in the mountains, 20, 30 amazing ski towns where it's just kind of fun to see. The far west part of the state, in the northwest corner, has got wild horse herds. Photography, you can go out there and you're isolated. The eastern part of the state, again, just for these little short weekend jaunts, it can be as dull as any place that you might stereotype in Kansas. Flat, treeless, but there's some neat towns and old historical forts you want to see, like from the wagon train days and the gold rush. So almost anywhere you can go there's enough interest, like I said earlier, where you can kill a weekend and still have fun and explore. So I don't think it'll be as challenging for most to go east in Colorado to find something interesting, because it's a challenge. But in most places in the country, you're going to find a place where you can find good weekend trips. Cute little towns where you go for a bed and breakfast or hiking trails. Anywhere with water can be interesting. It can be done on the cheap, and I don't mean just financially, time-wise. The problem with long weekends, your Memorial and Labor Days, is that everybody seems to be doing it. But if you can build an extra day into one of those to maybe a more obscure place where you get first shots at some of the lines, and second tier, maybe it can build on that extra time that you build in.
Excellent. All right, here's the money question. You're talking to me now. Okay, if I wanted to pursue traveling as a hobby, what's the most important piece of advice you'd give me?
I think probably start small and see if you like it. Because you might not. As far as like a full-time hobby where you're a travel fanatic, there's all kinds of other things, hiking, golf, sports, and culture. You might like all these things better than becoming a travel fanatic. But I do think once you start doing it, you will like it. So I guess start small. And like you mentioned, I might have said it earlier, the hotel room itself doesn't matter, because you should be out, again, with those rare exceptions of honeymoons or anniversaries, special occasions, you don't really care what the hotel is like that much. I would not spend a lot of time there. Get out into a city or a country and I guess start small and then just go from there. But get out rather than enjoying a nice room.
All right. That sounds like excellent advice. I appreciate that. Scott Wayne, travel author, historian extraordinaire. I really do appreciate the time and all of the advice around figuring out whether or not travel might be my midlife hobby. I appreciate it, sir.
All right. Great to be here. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it much.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our Instagram page, which you can find at midlife_hobby. Or follow us any place you can find podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. And of course, when you find something you like, you should always tell a friend about it. Also, I'd love to hear thoughts and suggestions about other hobbies or speakers. Send an email to midlife.hobby@gmail.com. I'll do everything I can to follow up with you. Special thanks goes to Sir William Osler for this episode's inspiration around hobbies. Sir William was a Canadian physician and one of the 4 founding professors of Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he said, "No man is really happy or safe without a hobby." Hope you'll join us next time for Wanted, a Midlife Hobby.